Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, pronouns he, him, and I direct events here at the Strand. Before we launch into discussion of Mark Prins' debut book, The Latinist, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after over 94 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers and the time of authors such as Mark and Brandon, we wouldn't be here today, and we so truly appreciate all of you. Tonight, we are thrilled to have with us Mark Prins for the launch of his debut novel, The Latinist. Mark is a recent graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and a recipient of fellowships from the Truman Capote Literary Trust, the Breadloaf Writers Conference, and the Sun Valley Writers Conference. He lives in Brooklyn, New York. Joining Mark in conversation tonight is Brandon Taylor. Brandon Taylor is the author of the novel Real Life and the collection Filthy Animals. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker Online, The Cut, Vulture, and elsewhere. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mark and Brandon to the stage.
Hi, Mark. How's it going?
It's very good. How are you, Brandon? I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so thrilled to be here. I got my copy just the other day. I'm so thrilled to be here to talk about The Latinist, this novel that I think I first read when we were at Iowa. I think I snuck a copy out of the cubbies, and
Yeah,
yeah,
I'm
no, go
I'm
ahead.
scared you read it. I'm scared you read it in that early draft because it was pretty brutal, but that is funny. I remember you saying you did.
Yeah, I read it and I really enjoyed it. And then I think I wrote you a fan mail or told you about it or something. But I mean, that's one of the great things about an MFA program is that you get to read these books when they're still very
Yeah,
gooey and
yeah.
coming together. And well, look at you now. Look at you now.
Look at you
Acclaim.
now.
Well, you're the acclaimed debut author of the hour. Will you start us off with a reading from it before we hop into discussion?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I'll just set the scene a little bit. And I also just want to say thank you to the Strand as well. It's such an iconic bookstore, and I'm so happy that they're hosting this. So in this section of the novel, Tessa, our heroine, is in Italy. I'm not going to give too much away for those who haven't read it, which is probably most of you, and she is told that she needs to you know keep herself busy for the day, and so she goes into Rome. And I'll just start. A shower, then a taxi to the metro station, and an hour ride into Rome. She could make it to the Borghese, then to the lovely restaurant in Prati she'd taken a shine to when she lived there for a month 2 summers before. Identical six-story building blocks gave way quickly to pine forest and farmland, then a series of small commuter suburbs, small houses capped in terracotta. The closer her train got to Termini, though, the more agitated she became. What if Lucrezia showed Ed the fragments in the necropolis and he told Chris? Yet in the flurry of people outside Termini station, she became suddenly not carefree, but unburdened. There was nothing else she could do at the moment and nowhere she needed to be. She idled in the flock of hurried, purposeful people, feeling pleasantly anonymous, then wandered to the concourse outside, drifting north through Rome's casual beauty, its garrulous architecture, its undulating side streets. Viator, traveler, she thought, as she tacked left and right. And what did it mean that she did not know where she felt most at home? In Jacksonville, Tessa and her sister were oddball children, fucking nerds, they've been called, though Tessa experienced a brief spell of popularity her sophomore year when some of the less intellectual boys decided, fleetingly, that she was hot. Sometimes Tessa missed the way she'd brown hitting tennis balls back and forth with Claire, her sister, missed the salty taste of sweat above her upper lip, the ribbon palm in front of their house, the ranunculus whorls of her mother's orchids, but mostly she didn't miss Florida at all. Tessa glimpsed the crown of a stone pine at the end of the Via Giacomo, evidence of the tree-lined edge of the Borghese Gardens. She made the 11 a.m. entrance and was the first inside the museum. She was immediately struck by the marble, the sheer quantity of it in the floors and the columns and the walls. Other museum goers moved quietly around her, so many with audio guides, the gallery resembled a silent disco. Tessa continued her wander to the third floor and toward the Apollo and Daphne room, feeling the statue's presence before she even laid eyes on it. They faced away from her, her first glimpse, and this was not by accident, always disorienting. She saw the backs of two figures in motion, the whorls of Apollo's garment like a hovering mollusk, the satiny curves of an arm, a hand, a leg, a breast. The statue required one to circle it so that its narrative unfolded in motion, suitable for Ovid's passage that at 115 lines had its protagonist almost entirely in movement. A frond of laurel leaves burst from Daphne's left thigh, sprigs of foliage sprayed from her hair to her outstretched hands. Darting up her leg was a sheet of bark. Her mouth was agape. Then Apollo's face in eerie serenity or ignorance of Daphne's drama. He could see perhaps a crescent of her cheek, the tip of her nose, while the viewer was left to imagine what Daphne saw in this final moment, her screaming eyes pointing into the statue's negative space. Their bodies continued to twist as Tessa circled, then Apollo's toga curved around his muscled torso, billowing behind him, and then she was again behind the figures. Tessa was always in awe of how Bernini could make marble seem so light and airy, like a meringue if he chose, or as dense and speckled as granite. She finished her first orbit, knowing she would do still more. She had bought a version of the statue for Chris here 2 summers before, a paperweight. It probably still lay somewhere in his house amongst his collection. Love, of course, meant ironically, love falling short. But Ben, her ex-boyfriend, Ben's love had fallen short too. What would his look like adapted to statue form, she wondered. It wouldn't be adapted to a statue, she felt suddenly. It could not move stone like that. It's a chase scene, someone says. Tessa turned to find the owner of this American voice, which was neither loud nor soft, but somehow pitched correctly for a museum. She took in a face, smooth skin, boyish, a few freckles which brought out the brown of his eyes, handsome. Hollywood spends millions on chase scenes with actual cars, to less effect than Bernini with stone, he continued. Tessa found herself agreeing and began to circle the statue again more slowly. He followed her. Art historian, she said, over her shoulder. He bent forward towards her. I'm in film, he said. She laughed at his light irony. He didn't look like an actor. His quarter zip hung long and boxy. His expression seemed thoughtful and vaguely introspective. Screenwriter, maybe, or set design. Maybe you chose the wrong medium, she said, slightly provocative, continuing to circle. Stone can be very stubborn, he responded. Not in the right hands, she nearly said, but she didn't. She stopped to read an inscription on the pedestal underneath Apollo's grasping arm, 2 lines from the Metamorphoses. Into foliage her hair, into branches her arms grow. Now sluggish roots cling to her swift foot. I didn't mean that exactly, he said. After this silence, what did you mean, Tessa asked. Just a few hours later. An endless arcade of umbrella-shaped pines came silently past Tessa's reflection in the taxi window. Voices jabbered on the radio in Italian, and signs reared their indecipherable messages in the plowing white beam of the headlight. She had splurged on a taxi back to Isla Sacra, and in the dark, she recalled the strange day in company with this man, the statue man, Quarter Zip. They had left the gallery together, and after 20 minutes of wandering the Borghese Gardens, she had made a joke about the ever-enlarging fact that they had not yet exchanged names, and they had continued to omit this basic formality through the early afternoon, relishing it, calling one another stranger playfully as they shared information. She talking on a surface level about teaching at Oxford, he admitting that his mediocre novel was being adapted into a movie in Rome. Rom-com, bank heist. And he'd been invited to the set and then told summarily to fuck off when he tried to exert some creative control of which he had none. She had lived only in Florida and Oxford, he everywhere, North Carolina, Georgia, Washington, Texas. He was a Navy brat. They walked for hours. The sun wore gradually through the dark, bruising clouds. And on their way to Prati, Tessa glimpsed a navy blue Maserati, and who but Alberto, the boyfriend of a character in Italy. Alberto stepping out of it, walking quickly into a serpentine side street. She'd become incensed. He was supposed to be in Brussels, and Quarter Zip had gamely come with Tessa as she chased Alberto's clicking loafers to a restaurant, feeling strangely proprietary about Lucrezia's heart, wondering aloud what defense he would come up with, whether she would tell Lucrezia how Tessa would confront him. Hello from Brussels. But when they'd entered the restaurant, she'd seen it was not Alberto at all. This man was older, with silver in his hair, a craggy face, meeting two adorable daughters and their grandmother for lunch. And following this, Tessa wondered aloud to Quarter Zip if she'd seen Alberto because of a latent envy of Lucrezia's relationship, a desire to see it dashed against the rocks of infidelity or mendacity. And Quarter Zip confessed to how he had discovered his girlfriend in LA cheating on him, how humiliating it had been, how it had led to him accepting the empty gesture invitation to come to Rome, where he was now in limbo with a free room, nevertheless, at an expensive hotel near Termini. Their jaunt through Rome had gone from conspiratorial and fun to a more heavy and perhaps emotionally laden journey. And on their continued walk, Tessa found that not exchanging names had become something solemn and protective, insulating and permissive, a minor elision at first, which had widened and could contain more emotionally, and into which they began to spill more personal details, childhood narratives, most embarrassing stories, where they lost their virginities. She thought of Apollo and Daphne, not of the chase, nor of Daphne's wordless scream, but of the sensuousness of their bodies folding into one another. And a subcurrent of desire lingered with her through dinner and Trastevere, where Tessa spoke about her father, his philosophical tyranny, his inability to question his own tenets, the way he needed the woman in his life to reflect back his putative worldview. Yet here in the pause when Quarter Zip used the bathroom and her fingers clutched a fold of table fabric, she felt a shift, the beginnings of resistance to this person, and the sensation that she had trusted too far. Afterwards, when he began to direct their course back towards the expensive hotel, she didn't object, and she thought maybe she could disappear into Quarter Zip's clean sheets, buy a new pair of shoes, get a massage, get drunk on martinis, let go, be in the moment. For a few seconds, it had seemed like maybe Marius didn't exist. She let herself slide into this possibility, its contours. They had a drink in his hotel bar, but finally it had become clear to Tessa that they had exchanged too much, that it would feel somehow wrong to exchange names too, that what had begun as an exciting game had led them to a strange and uncomfortable loneliness. And she felt her hold on something slipping. She was slipping away. When he signed the bill in the bar, she looked away from his signature as if he were a stranger undressing. When she insisted she return to where she needed to go, he told her not to, asked at least for her name, for her number, to see her again in Rome. What is this, Cinderella? Are you a pumpkin? You can't be serious. At least tell me your name. It all felt ignominiously like her relationship with Ben, an encapsulation of its failure, her unwillingness to open up, to be seen. And yet the prospect of meeting this man again in Rome, or even telling her name, gave her a shiver of repulsion. Even now, as the taxi pulled into the driveway of the Soprantenza lodgings, and Tessa exhaled a breath of relief. In the bathroom upstairs, Tessa found Lucrezia brushing her teeth. Fun day? Lucrezia asked Tessa's reflection. Tessa nodded, smiling. She was glad that she had taken Lucrezia's advice.
Oh, I love that part of the book so much. It is so intense. It's so intense, and it's also very Cusky too. Like there's something very kind of Rachel Cusk about it. Like this woman who's like slipped out of the context of her life into a new context, and she's just kind of enjoying the sort of liminal like ambiguity of it, and then the context of her life comes rudely back and she's like, no, I have to get out of here, it's too much.
Yeah, of course. And yeah, Cusk was an influence, especially on that part. The book, the Last Supper, is an amazing book by her that I don't think many people have read, but it's awesome.
I have that one in my Cusk pile that's back there
Really?
somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll have to dig in. I guess the place to start is in the beginning, and so
Yeah.
could you tell us a little bit about both where this idea for the novel came from? Like it's such a weird, propulsive, very plotty novel. Like not many people would think to marry like the sort of intensity and compelling page turneriness of a thriller with a
Right.
campus novel with Latin,
Right.
like those, that seems like a sort of strange, a group of strange bedfellows. And so I guess my first question is, where did the idea for the novel come from, and how did all these different parts come together?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there are kind of two components to that. And I mean, the book is called The Latinist. And when I was a teenager, like my idea of fun was translating Virgil's Aeneid from the Latin into the English, which, as you can imagine, won me many friends in high school. And it was a love of mine. I was a total Latin nerd. And so I think in some ways, although I didn't end up becoming a classicist, writing a book about classicists was like a bit of wish fulfillment for me, where it was, the life that I didn't live, but that I would have loved to have lived. But the story with the novel in particular, I mean, I was in my first year at the Iowa Writers Workshop, and I was writing about three young people in New York City. And one of them was a classicist who had been to Oxford, as I had been for my junior year of college. I spent the whole year in Oxford. So one character was a classicist from Oxford, and the other was a ballet dancer with one leg. And everyone was bored by this, project, including myself. And it was in the second year at Iowa when I kind of had my back against the wall and I was about to quit writing entirely, when I looked back at some of the things I had written before. And there were a few passages written from the perspective of the classicists' dissertation advisor at Oxford. And they had more energy. They were the only good things I had written that year. So I immediately wrote the first chapter and put it up for workshop, and it kind of struck a nerve. And so that's kind of how it all got started.
I'm gonna adjust my mic. People said that it was very quiet. Is it louder
Okay.
now?
I
I
can
don't
hear
know.
pretty clearly.
Okay. So I love that idea of writing a book and then everyone being bored by it, and so then you just
Yeah,
like ripping it up and deciding to go
completely.
to go elsewhere. I also love the idea of writing about a Latinist or a classicist as a way of like giving yourself that dream that you had always wanted. I feel that I often
Yeah,
do that myself when I keep finding myself writing about math people, even though I'm not a
really.
mathematician. I mean, there's something really delightful about sort of setting a novel within a world that you really wish to inhabit, because it takes a long time to write a novel, Mark.
Yeah, I know.
You really gotta live in there. And so I guess I'd love to know. So this novel covers so much ground, both in terms of plot but also material. And so I'm imagining there was a lot of research, or maybe there wasn't, that went into this book. And so could you tell us also a little bit about the research process for sort of gathering the various threads
Yeah.
that you bring together?
Yeah, I mean, the research process was so kind of layered. I mean, there were so many different components of it. And, it started with me seeing this weird article in The Lancet, which is a medical journal, about I don't want to give too much away from the novel, but an article about a special or particular femur that had been discovered in a Roman necropolis on the island of Isola Sacra, which is very close to the ancient port of Ostia, which was, ancient Rome's sort of port city. It's actually right next to the Leonardo da Vinci airport. So if you fly into Rome, you will fly over, Isola Sacra and Ostia, and you can see all of these things. But I discovered this article about this weird femur that had been discovered there, and it related to this one-legged ballet dancer that I was writing about, who will never be resurrected in my fiction again. But the so that led me to Isla Sacra, and that just started this weird sort of obsession with that island. And, there was a lot of research that went into the island. There was a lot of research that went into inventing a fictional Latin poet. And there was a lot of research that went into academia as well, because I myself don't have a PhD in classics. And even things like getting into the world of Chris. Chris is a middle-aged British man who's from the county of Hampshire, which I've never been to in my life. So there was a lot of research in the landscape, and the characters. And, there were different components that I can talk about, all day, but I'll leave it there for now.
I mean, I'm so amazed by the level of detail that you bring to the poets in this
Mm,
novel. I mean, some of which are real and some of which are not. Are all of the poets real? You invent a poet, yeah? Like you.
yeah. Yeah. Uh, I mean, there's some things in fact in history that were so good that I had to put it in.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I don't want to say what those are because it's a huge spoiler, but I could talk around it a little bit. But then most everything else was invented and sort of based on, other little known or minor poets that we still have fragments of today from ancient Rome.
I mean,
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, with some literary novels, plot wouldn't really. We could spoil all day because there is no plot in most literary novels. But this one, there's so. Mark, there's so much plot in this book. Like
yeah,
there's a
yeah.
tremendous plot. I'm curious what for you when we first encounter Tessa, she's kind of, I mean, she's kind of in a place of like possibility. Her future's really opening up. She's getting ready to graduate. She's gonna, she's got the great conference paper. People are really starting to say her name. She's got all these great
Yeah,
jobs lined up and interviews. And the inciting incident is that it all kind of goes to hell for
yeah.
her in ways both hilarious and also really, really heartbreaking. But I'm curious where the first threads of the story were for you. Like what was the first scene that you wrote? Did you know that she was going to be sort of riding this golden cloud and that it was all going to come apart, or was some other image super important to the sort of the flashpoint of the book?
I mean, the first image is the one that opens the book. It was the same for me, which is the cigarette landing in the middle of the green Oxford quad. And, I've had the privilege of having been to Oxford. And the first time I walked into the college that I was a part of and saw what it looked like in that school, my jaw dropped. It's the most beautiful, beautiful scenery you've ever seen in your life. And so you're not even allowed to walk on these quads. They're like green grass quadrangles. They're taken care of. They're so immaculate and manicured. And I just saw this cigarette drop plop right into the middle while Tessa is teaching her class. And I knew it came from Christopher Eccles' Open Window. And it's such a no-no. And I was just like, they were talking about entitlement. And I was like, okay, like this makes sense to me right here, this little microcosm. But that was the first image for sure.
Oh, I love that. I love that. And I guess my next question has to do with settings. So you set us up beautifully there. So one of the first settings that we encounter is Oxford. It's
Mhm.
beautiful. It's green. We enter with a sense of tradition and convention, and convention's already being sort of flouted with the cigarette butt dropping out of the sky, so to speak, which is also like kind of something out of a Greek myth. It feels kind of like a
Yeah,
thing from on high appearing
yeah,
and disrupting the status quo. And then we move from one sort of set of deeply entrenched like conventions and traditions, and we move to Rome,
yeah, yeah.
and to Italy, where there's another set of like really beautiful sets
Mhm.
of like ancient history and convention and the like. Setting feels so important to this novel, to the story, to the characters in the story. The characters, in fact, spend many, many pages just like ruminating on
Yeah,
divers and different
yeah,
milieu and
yeah.
stuff like that. And so I'm curious about your approach to setting, both in terms of like, do you know the settings and then you set out a new research and then you bring it into the novel, or does the story tell you where the settings need to be? And then your approach to rendering setting and the writing.
Yeah. I wish that there was like an efficient, like there was like a way that I could break it down in a formula because it's so inefficient. I mean, a lot of it, especially with Italy, I mean, I was stuck on the Italy section for 9 months basically because there was just no way of making it work. And I was really worried that it was going to sink the entire novel because, it just didn't fit right. And a lot of it was writing the setting or putting the characters in the setting and just doing it really badly and just doing it a couple of times really, really poorly. but eventually in your own like brain space, like your own like metaverse, it begins to actually take shape. And then it begins to have meaning to the characters, and the landscape begins because once it has meaning to the characters, then it can work in a novel, is the way that I approach it. So I wish I had a way to say like this is the way to do it, but there's no fast way. It took forever. But yeah.
I'm curious about the the book breaking difficulty of the Italy section, because like
Yeah.
that section feels so, I don't know, it feels so not easy, but it doesn't feel extra fraught. Like you don't feel, I don't
Mm.
feel you on the other side of the page getting like all tense about now we're in Italy. It felt so seamless and so natural. So like what was the difficulty in your, that sort of deranged you for 9 months
Yeah.
from the.
It's funny because I'm curious about the how gooey the draft was that you read at Iowa City, because I remember Italy being pretty gooey at that point. It's like, what was it that deranged me? I mean, I will say one of the best pieces of advice that I got was from Margot Livesey, who's a teacher and an amazing writer, a teacher at Iowa, who suggested that I move one of the big sort of moments in the book from, page 80 to the very end of the book.
Mhm.
And that kept a lot of tension in the novel that enabled Tessa to sort of explore the landscape of Italy and to take a lot of time there to set the scene. And then the suspense was still kind of held, whereas until that point, I was like, where's the suspense coming from, or where's the interest coming from? Because so much had been resolved already. And that was a big, big help for me. And it helped me get past that section.
Yeah, I mean, the book is definitely one of those novels that seems like it feeds on those longer lines of tension, right? Like
Yeah.
there's this really, I mean, I would say that never has more been wrung out of a looming conference in an academic setting. I have never seen it used to better effect than in this novel. I mean, it's really quite astonishing. I found myself being like, yeah, what's going to happen at this conference? Like he's got to give the paper. Like what's going to happen? And I'm like, is he getting me so riled up about like a conference paper? And
Well,
yet,
yeah. I mean, it reminded me a little bit of and I mentioned this to you a few weeks ago about the dinner scene in real life. And there's kind of this build up, and there are all of these moving parts. And then it's like climax. It's like so cathartic in some ways and not in other ways. And yeah, I mean, the academic conference was really, really fun to write. And I hope that people enjoy it when they get to it.
yeah, I mean, it's one of those scenes that I cannot wait to see people talking about it, because I think it's going to be one of those things that people talk about for a long time. I mean, it's it's so juicy. I guess so we've talked about setting. I'm curious about, so the settings, Oxford, Italy, but another sort of really important setting for this book is the past. There's
Right.
like Tessa's sort of personal past. We get bits of information about her family, her time in Jacksonville, the sort of things that she's overcome and the things that she's still kind of wrestling with. And then there's the idea of like the past. So she's studying these ancient texts. And then there's like the sort of even more ancient past, like the past of mythology, like the past
Mm.
as like a setting and a place and a set of ideas. And I'm so curious about how your approach to writing characters who themselves are so deeply, whose like like the central idea of their lives is like thinking about stuff that isn't real. So you
Yeah.
have these
Yeah.
fictional characters who are thinking about mythology, which
Right.
is like a kind of shared like a shared prehistorical past in a way. And so
Yeah.
I'm curious about all of that, your approach to
Yeah.
writing fictional people thinking about fictional things set in a fictional past.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there are a couple parts to it. Like, and I love that question. I mean, I personally feel like I can relate to it as a writer, and so much of my time is spent with fictional characters and with the fictions of other writers. And so I do feel like on some degree I can just relate to it. But also, I mean, the book, and I found myself getting more interested in this as I was writing it, but the book is very interested in the reception of literature. And I didn't realize that reception is, an entire field within the study of classics itself. So they'll study, how the statue by Bernini is a reception of Ovid's myth of Apollo and Daphne, and how, if I'm reading a text in 2022, that's my reception of Ovid, which would be different from how it would be read in the Renaissance. And so it's really interesting because you start to think about how every text is refracted through the eyes of the person who's reading it, but also the society that it's being read in. And so one of the really fun things about writing this book was thinking about the Apollo and Daphne myth and how it would have been received in the 15th century, how it would be received now, and how that's even changing over the course of me writing the book, over 4 years. And then finally, how Tessa can't see the Apollo and Daphne myth the same herself, like how this can be tracked over the course of a lifetime, and how the myth can mean something very different to her when she was 14 to when she's 27 and all of the events of the novel take place. And so I found myself maybe like obsessing a little bit about this idea of reception and getting in kind of deep, but it's really fun when you start to think about it a lot. And I feel like the book kind of gave me like a platform to talk about it and explore it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's kind of funny. I feel like the equivalent of the Bernini statue is like when your book gets made into a movie. Like that does somehow feel like the equivalent cultural action in some way.
Well, even when I saw the cover of the book, which I'm obsessed with, it felt like, I was witnessing the sort of reception of the book and the interchange between that and the statue. So it's everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it is this sort of inescapable matrix of intertextual relationships and stuff
Exactly.
like that.
Yeah.
And for those of you in the audience who are not like immediately thrilled by the prospect of like complicated discussions of Latin, there's so much other stuff in this book, and also the discussions of translation I found so fascinating, in a way that was very similar to Katie Kitamura's novel, which came out last year, which is also about a translator. I mean, I feel like you do a very similar thing where you make translations so compelling, and you really do such an excellent job of cracking open some of like the ethical and like moral questions at the heart of translation. And I feel like one of the things that Tessa is always trying to get her students to come back to, and the thing that she seems to be most alive to in this work, is that it's poetry. Like she keeps
Mm.
coming back to the idea of poetry and human feeling, and at the end of the day, these are like evocations of like a feeling and these difficult things, and I found
Yeah.
that like really like really quite moving, and I was like, wow, Tessa's such a great teacher. I really I really want to take her class.
I would love to take Tessa's class. I think she's a great teacher. I think that Florence has a very bright future as a translator. And, the translations were really fun to write, like the fake translations, um, because it's not real Latin. I mean, I was making up the translations, and it was fun to try to write a bad translation and then a good translation and to play with the rhythm. And it felt like it was really important for Tessa to come on the page, to have that poetry, and for the reader to have a sense of like what it feels like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, but like I'm so curious
Mhm.
about. So one of my favorite things in a book is when a book has. I love books about writers because then the writer gets to just sort of like go ham and like make up stuff, like their
Yeah.
idea of like a bad thing and then like their idea of like a good thing. Like I love writing about writing in that way, and so this book was right up my alley for several reasons. Um, when you sat down to like write those poems and then those
Mhm.
bad translations and good translations, like what was one, were you incredibly nervous, and two, can you tell us a little bit more about like why that was like so much fun, because you said it seems like you also enjoy the making up of text
Yeah.
within text.
Yeah. I think it was like, I think it was just trying to achieve the sort of rhythm of these Olympian iambs, or at least something that would represent that, but also it was fun because it's about this island in, off of Rome, and about this invented story about a poet who lived there, and, a love affair, and Apollo and Daphne. And I was kind of like, if I can just get this to work and to make this real, then it could be so cool. And so I think that's what became fun about it. I was like, if I can get the rhythm to be exciting, kind of similar to the way I think about like plot and the thriller aspect. Like if I can get the corpus inscriptionum Latinarum to be it's palpable to people, if I can wrap it in enough bacon that people will be willing to have it as a meal, then that is so exciting to me. And so that's what I was really trying to achieve, with the poetry, and also with a lot of the obscure references to ancient texts.
Yeah, I really loved it. And I love the idea that you, as you alluded to at the top of the convo, you that some of it is real and some of it isn't.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and so I love this idea of like there being like a secret tucked within the thing, because that feels like a very Marius thing to do. It feels very
yeah. Yeah, or even, I mean, one of the things that I love about Ovid is how playful Ovid is, and how subversive and provocative and, you know, almost and mannerist. I feel like it's something that Ovid might do. It's something that Nabokov might do. And those were sort of inspirations for that element of it.
Yeah. Well, this book, I mean, this book has a clear genealogy. Like for me reading it, I was detecting notes of Rachel Cusk, I was detecting notes of Patricia Highsmith. Like there's so
Mhm.
many writers who could feel pulses from in this book. Could you tell us a little bit more about who were some of the writers who were sort of breathing down your neck as you were writing
Yeah,
the book, and who you were looking to for guidance and inspiration?
yeah. So Rachel Cusk, as you mentioned, I discovered Rachel, or started reading Rachel Cusk, maybe in the last year of writing the novel, and became obsessed and just read everything that she's published. And so the way that she dramatizes consciousness, the way that she writes sentences, the cerebral characters, those sort of permeated the rewrites of the novel. And but you also have Patricia Highsmith, especially the Talented Mr. Ripley books. I mean, there's a way in which Chris's consciousness, that close third person, is so implicating in the same way that Tom Ripley's is in those books. And Gillian Flynn is a huge influence. The switching back and forth of perspectives between Tessa and Chris, kind of like she does in Gone Girl. And then there's Ovid himself. I mean, the way that he's so subversive, the way that it's hard to, to find a center morally,
Mm-hmm.
to, center yourself, or to have any sort of moral perspective. He's constantly subverting that. And that, I think, permeates the novel as well. There are so many others that I could think of, but I think those were really the main ones.
Yeah. I want to remind everybody to get your questions into the Ask a Question Q&A box at the bottom of the chat. I love what you say about Chris, who we sort of like danced around this conversation for various reasons. But I love so much of what you just said about him, and that like I feel like this novel was one of those moments where I realized the difference between like a character who is like moral and that you kind of agree with, and then like a character who you have sympathy for. And I feel like you do such a great job of like creating this character who in one scene you're like, oh man, what are you doing, what a bad choice, don't do that, oh no.
Yeah.
And then in another scene you find yourself really feeling for him, because he is someone who is capable of such feeling, and
Mhm.
his life has not been easy, and nothing
Mhm.
about his situation is easy. And so it is this really, I feel like that's one of the more destabilizing things about the novel, is that Chris
Yeah.
is so morally, he is not in the right, like
Yeah. Yeah.
like he well,
Yeah.
but in terms of sympathy, you do such a great job of inhabiting him without judgment, that you can't help but to feel like, ugh, my heart is in my throat for this person. but also I
Yeah.
want to fight him. So
Yeah. Yeah.
could you tell us a little bit about how you go about creating that tension between sort of moral ambiguity, but also like great sympathy for these characters?
Yeah. Well, with Chris, on the one hand, he was kind of fun to write in the sense that he brings a lot of energy and he has a very strong desire, and which is, he's in love with Tessa. And he's sort of, I mean, he is always doing the bad thing that would maybe occur to like a sane person, but usually there's a side of you that will be like, no, like you can't do that because we're normal socialized human beings. And so Chris is just always doing that thing. And there's a saying that like plot is bad behavior. And so Chris brings a lot of that to the novel. But there's also, difficulties with him because he is a little bit more, he doesn't have necessarily as much dimension to him as Tessa does. He lacks empathy. It's hard to bring more dimension and substance to his character. And so that was, a challenge. And towards, the second half of the book, when he somewhat reluctantly begins to become a caretaker for his mother, and sometimes he does things that by a weird twisted logic you can see how he thinks he's helping but he's not. And you begin to understand some of what his passions are. It was important for me to humanize him as much as possible. And I hope that I achieve that to some degree, because people are so all over the map about Chris. Some of them are just no, like 100% socio. He's crazy. He needs to go. And other people are like, but he's in love with her. Like it all makes sense. Like, so it's funny. Like people have very different reactions to him.
I think that's how you know you've created like a genuinely striking character. I mean, I'm sort of I'm splitting the difference. I think yeah, he's in love with her, but also what oof, he needs help. Like he is
Yeah.
unwell. Like
Yeah. He's unhinged.
he's not doing well. But none of us are at this point in history. Let's start taking some audience cues. This is from Anonymous. Will you continue using classics as an influence for any future writings? Maybe a series.
Great question. Maybe a sequel called The Hellenist. I'm not sure.
Awesome. That'd
Um,
be fantastic. I'd read it.
I I'm not sure. As I think the classics will probably be an influence, but maybe won't be as salient of an influence. I don't think I'm going to write, or at least don't have plans to write another book about classicists, but I have no doubt that the classics will find their way into the next book in one way or another.
I hope they do. You write about them so well. It made me want to learn Latin. So hopefully, I have my fingers crossed. This one's from Connor. With the poetry, do you have a background in it? Was it difficult writing in a different genre?
Oh, interesting. The short answer is no, I don't really have a background in poetry. I mean, it's kind of in my family in the sense that like my dad at one point really wanted to become a poet. My brother is a poet. I love poetry, but had never really attempted to write it except in like a very jokey way in high school and college. So a lot of it was just trying to do it on the fly and imitating poets that I really, really like.
Oh, I love it when people make up poems in books. It's like one of my favorite things. So hopefully more poems in your future books as well. This is from Jane. I'm looking forward to reading the book. The discussion makes me think of A.S. Byatt's Possession, the made-up poems, a discovery of an unknown text. Was this book a source of inspiration too? You didn't mention it, Jane.
Yes, that was the one that I was like, did I catch every one that I was meant to say for influences? A.S. Byatt's Possession was a huge influence. The literary one-upman, I'm sorry, the academic one-upmanship, the discoveries about the dead poet, it was a huge influence. And the other one that I forgot that I'm remembering right now is The Last Samurai by Helen DeWitt, which is an amazing, amazing novel, and which had, a less direct, but still, big influence on the novel.
Yeah, A.S. Byatt is so good. It's
Yeah.
underrated. What a
Yeah.
writer. A lot of the influences you mentioned navigate moral ambiguity in their work. Nana Kodai, Ovid, cusk to an extent. Do you consider a characters of yours morality? Is it a writerly concern for you?
Hmm. That's, yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. I think that, real people exist in, shades of gray. And I definitely try to reflect that as much as I can in my writing. But I'm also kind of aware of, I always am kind of aware of a reader who's deciding whether they like or don't like a character. And I feel like that's kind of a fun thing to play with a little bit. And it's almost like there's a little like justice, the sand and the little, what are they called? Whatever, weighing of justice. And I kind of have that in my head as I'm writing. And yeah, I think it's a concern, but I don't know if it's necessarily morality. I think it's kind of playing with expectations and reactions.
Yeah, I love that. I love a morally ambiguous character. It's all
Mm,
the fun. It's,
yeah.
no one, if you have all the answers, it's not as fun. Your point on translations is such a good one. Everyone is a choice that, with one word change, could be a slightly different translation or could take on a new meaning. Was your experience the same with writing the book? Did you know before you had finished how the plot would unravel, or did you surprise yourself with how you ended up for Chris, Tessa, and the story as a whole?
I I definitely surprised myself a number of times. And I hope the reader is surprised as well. But I will say I had an idea of like the broad arc, and then it was just a matter of figuring out how to get there. And a lot of that was just in the different ways that Chris and Tessa interpret the role of love in the passage of Apollo and Daphne. And there's sort of argument about the footnote that sort of opens the novel. And about the translation and the specific words and translations, I mean, I think it matters a huge amount. I mean, I was lucky enough to learn Latin when I was in high school and in college, and so I can read it. I can't really read it fluently, but I can translate the Apollo and Daphne passage myself. And I look at these translations, and some of them just like have weird insertions. Like they talk about how one of them talks about how how Daphne, when she's turned into a tree, gives full consent to what has just happened to her. And it's just not in the Latin. And I'm like, who translated this? Or because it's not even in a particular meter that makes sense. It just was like slapped on. And so I think it makes a huge difference because that matters so much for how you read that passage. And yeah, so the answer is yes. Like, I think it's enormously consequential.
Yeah, oofs. And some of those like very early translations of I'm thinking of my own experience of like
Mhm.
reading Zola and like going back and reading some of the original French and some of those first translations, and I'm like, they were just making stuff up. Like they were
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
slapping stuff in there. Like what is going
And
on?
sometimes it makes sense to me, like in the Golding translation of the Metamorphoses that presumably Shakespeare was using when he was reading, you know, they're writing it in meter. And so it's rhyming couplets and it makes sense why you would throw something in. But then at other times, it's just like, why did you add that? It's just strange. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, but it is fascinating because it tells you so much about the translator. Almost.
exactly. Exactly. And that's this whole idea of reception. It's like you're learning more about the person who's receiving it than you are about the text itself.
Totally, which I love, but that is for Freud. This is from Matthew. For my first read, it was absolutely a classic page turner, but for my next read, I'll almost certainly slow down and research the classics and mythology for a full appreciation. When you were writing, did you have a vision for how your audience might read the book? Quickly, slowly, both, multiple times?
I wanted it to be able to be read quickly, and I wanted it also to be able to be read slowly. It was important to me that it could be read quickly. And so I'm happy that, Matthew, you were able to read it quickly. I think that there's also a lot in it if you want to read it again and read it more slowly. But yeah, so the answer is both, all of the above.
I mean, I read it in its current incarnation in like a day. Like it was
Yeah, you were
so
fast.
I mean, it reads so quickly because you're like, oh my God, and then what happened? And
Mm.
then what happened? Oh my God. Like it's so very, very compelling and also so heady. Like it's incredibly intellectual, but also you want to know what happens to the people. And I think that that is like incredibly difficult to pull off. Here's one. Do you embrace the dark academia label for this novel? Twitter already has. Why or why not? And I feel like I am responsible for Twitter and calling it dark academia, but I stand by it.
I don't know if I'm an expert on what dark academia means exactly. I'm sure that you could speak better to it than I can, but from what I know of it, I definitely embrace it. I think that the, aesthetic is consistent with, what you see in a lot of dark academia, or what I've seen of it. But maybe you can speak more to that, Brandon.
I think it's 10 out of 10 dark academia. It's
Uh-huh.
like
Uh-huh.
spooky old
Uh-huh.
university, like
Mhm.
Latin, like academic infighting and intense psychosexual melodrama. Like it's
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
10 like it's 10 for 10 dark
Yeah.
academia. I yeah. It's yes. And that is one of its strengths, I will say.
So yes, I definitely embrace it.
Oh, I love this question.
Uh-huh.
This is also from Anonymous. There was some great focus on gardening and botany sprinkled throughout the
Mm.
book. Is that an interest of yours that predated the book or another deep dive you did to get some texture?
It's a deep dive that I did to get some texture because I grew up in a concrete jungle and I know absolutely nothing about plants. And there was a point where, because my father does know about plants, and he read the draft at one point and he was like, "This is a great book, Mark. You've done a wonderful job, but like you got to work on your plants because this flower would not be in season here. Like this would not be in flower. Like this." Yeah, he was just like, you need to start over. And so he was actually responsible for helping me a bit. But like Chris loves plants, and I felt like they were a way for me to give Chris a lot of texture. And I just love the way their names sound. Uh, just don't know that much about them yet, but
Oh
I'm
my
still learning.
gosh. I mean, I think that one of the things you need to do in the promo for this book is one, do a playlist of all the music in the book, and two, get us like a list of all the plants. I think people would love
Mm.
that. We want to take us on a botany tour of the Latinist.
A
Um,
botany tour would be great. Botanical
that
gardens.
that would be so lit. You should really think about it. I love this question from Pander. Given how long you've been working on the novel, what did it feel like to be done? Do you still itch to edit it?
Yes, I do itch to edit it. I can't scratch the itch anymore. It felt really good to be done. I finished, you know, I really pretty much finished about a year ago, and it felt great. Like kind of a load off my shoulders. But, I look back at it now and sometimes I'm like, that paragraph doesn't end well. Like I'm reading Maria Hummel's Still Lives right now, and every paragraph just ends with like this little shot of like candy or something, or just like a little dart of something interesting or funny. And I'm like, I wish I could end all of my paragraphs that way. And I'm like, every day it's a different thing, but maybe in the next book.
That's a very pacey that's a very pacey tense novel, Still Lives by
Yeah,
Maria
I'm
Hummel.
still in it. I'm still in it.
It's
I'm liking
it's
it.
wild. I have no idea.
Yeah.
We'll book club it after because I have,
Yeah.
I have so many questions about that book. Here is I love this. Have you started working on your next novel? Unfortunately, I finished The Latinist very quickly and am now hungry for more of your work.
Oh, that's very sweet. I really appreciate that. I am working on something. The way that I write, is I usually, like, I'm not an architect. I have a blueprint, but then that fails miserably. And fortunately, usually in there's like the jewel of something else. And, that's how I got onto this after writing about, this classicist and this one-legged ballerina. Um, and so I'm writing something about the metaverse and its fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. And it's, I don't know, like I'm fascinated by the metaverse. Like you and I are both purveyors of synthetic realities as storytellers or fiction writers. And this is a weird new manifestation of it. And the injection of capitalism like poses all of these questions about which reality takes priority. And that's a question that I can relate to so deeply as a writer. So hopefully there's some fruitful material there, but I have no idea what it's going to be exactly. Yeah.
I can't wait to see what comes out of that. That sounds so wacky. I can't wait. And so I think this will be our last question. Mark, do you have a favorite Greek myth? Is it Daphne and Apollo?
Mm. Um, that's a great question. I mean, the actual answer is yes, but I feel kind of bad giving that answer. I mean, I also love the myth, and it's in the book a little bit, of Diana and Actaeon. And Actaeon is the hunter who accidentally sees Diana, the goddess Diana, naked in a pool, and Diana basically sets his dogs on him, and he gets eaten alive. And there's some little, allusions to that myth in the book, but I don't know, something about that. It's so brutal and just so like dogs chasing you, and I don't know. But yeah, Daphne and Apollo is really probably my favorite one.
Oh, I love that. That's so beautiful. I think that's it.
That's
We're
it.
done at
Okay.
8. I think that's, unless you want to
Okay.
answer one more, but I think we're done. Yeah, Sabir?
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
It
No
was a
worries.
fantastic conversation, though. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Sabir and the Strand, and thank you, Brandon, so much. It was great. I was really happy to be here.
It was a thrill. I had so much fun.
It was a pleasure to host you both. For our audience, thank you for joining us. If you have yet to order Mark's book, The Latinist, I've dropped the link in the chat. It will also be emailed to you tomorrow as well. And on that note, thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic evening.
Thank you.